it away from here.
Great. Thank you, Christine. Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie. I'm co-founder and chief strategy officer at Haku. I'm really excited to be here moderating this panel for you all with some amazing, incredibly knowledgeable experts. I'm just excited as well because this is an opportunity for us at Haku to learn from these knowledgeable panelists as well alongside you all. And for us to get all of us as endurance industry people to get great actionable advice from Chris, Angela, and Tim. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists and we'll get into the discussion. So first up, we have Chris Mosier. Chris is a trailblazing Hall of Fame triathlete, All-American duathlete, and six-time member of Team USA. Quite some incredible accomplishments. In 2015, he became the first known transgender man to represent the United States in international competition and was the catalyst for change for the International Olympic Committee policy on transgender athletes. He's also a 2 times national champion and the first transgender athlete to compete in the Olympic trials in any sport in a category different than their sex assigned at birth. And he is known as the go-to source for policy and information on transgender people in sports. So welcome, Chris. We're so excited to have you here. Next, we have Angela Rodriguez, who is head of strategy at Alma. Angela has spent nearly 20 years uncovering the interplays of global US and Latinx culture, helping brands succeed with Hispanic and non-Hispanic consumers alike. She heads up Alma's Culture Lab, which is an innovation think tank that leads the marketplace in cultural curation, consulting, and research. Among the brands she currently helps grow by connecting them with consumers in more culturally relevant ways are McDonald's, Sprint, Miller Lite, Clorox, PNC Bank, just some of the big brands that she's worked with and helped them engage with culturally diverse communities. And Alma is an agency of modern culture marketers with diversity and inclusion at its DNA. They're ranked the 4th most effective agency in the country. And if you're not familiar with their work, I highly recommend you go check it out. One of my favorites happens to be the work that they did with Netflix for their Narcos Spanish lessons. Really, really great, authentic content creation that they did for Netflix. And last but certainly not least, we have Tim Springer, who's an accessibility and inclusivity leader and CEO at Level Access, the market leader in digital accessibility. So Tim founded Level Access with the vision of creating a world where all digital systems are accessible to people with disabilities. For 2 decades, Level Access has provided digital accessibility compliance solutions for corporations, government agencies, and leading education institutions. He was awarded recognition as a Disability Employment Champion of Change by the White House in 2014. So welcome to all of our panelists. We're super excited to have you here and super excited to learn from all of your knowledge and expertise. So let's just get started. The first question, we can start, Chris, if you want to answer on this one first. Why should DEIA be a priority for us in the endurance industry?
Well, I think first, wouldn't take much beyond looking at this panel, right? The makeup of this panel even lacks some diversity that's within our constituency of running. And so we need to be able to make sure that we are representing all of the people who want to participate in our sports and all of the people who are currently participating in our sports and removing the barriers to access for those folks. And so this isn't just about removing barriers for people with disabilities. It's about removing barriers for trans and non-binary people, for Black runners, making sure that we're creating spaces where people see authentic representation of themselves, know the policies and procedures that are in place are there to support them, encourage them, welcome them into the sport. And then, obviously, we just want to grow the sport. Running is something that is incredible for all people. And, if you have a body, you are an athlete. It doesn't matter how fast you are. It doesn't matter how far you go. People want to participate in our local races, in our world majors. They want to participate in the sport, and we're ready and willing and able to welcome them into the sport with open arms and policies, procedures, and registration processes in place that welcome and support them.
Great, thank you. Angela, you want to weigh in on that as well? Why should the endurance community, why should the endurance industry be putting DEIA at the forefront of the work that they're doing?
Yeah, I echo Chris's comments. And I think one thing that I could build on is to say it's about equity. I think those of us who are in the planning positions of the sports can have outreach and bring in communities that aren't maybe already in that space and create kind of health equities for underrepresented communities. I think it's a huge space that our community outreaches sometimes don't really build on. They stay a little bit high level and kind of here's some money, but if we pull people in, young kids in particular, kids of color, I think that's a huge opportunity. And if you're thinking about it at the forefront of the planning of an event, and how can you bring in these kids and create energy around them, you'll change the health outcomes of a generation, really. Entire communities could be improved.
Wonderful. And Tim, what are your thoughts on our community creating, DEIA initiatives and making those a priority?
I'd probably give you two arguments. I think there's an ethical argument, and I think there's an operational argument, or a capitalist argument if you want the more cynical version of that. Ethically, it tends not to be more complicated than it's just the right thing to do. And sport's one of the universal connections of humanity, when we all like to play and we all like to play together. And so in my experience, it doesn't have to be more complicated than that you can just start with, like, this is something we all want to do together. And your logic can short circuit at that. And that's good. That's reasonable. That's a good approach. And so I think ethically, it's going to align with most everybody's core beliefs. If you then take a completely logical, cynical, and I'm using the word capitalist approach to this because I come from a for-profit background. I think operationally, to compete in today's market, you really do have to do this. From a brand perspective, and I think Chris, you touched on this. If you want to grow the sport, you can have a lot of examples. We don't have to get into them, of sports that are not inclusive and that have had some major challenges because of it. Really today's consumers, but participants, the broader community around a sport, they expect to work with organizations that believe what they want to believe. And when organizations are intolerant or exclusive of particular communities, it really harms them. So that's kind of the brand aspect of it. There's also a slightly more subtle one on the employer aspect of it, which is, all the organizations in this space are built on people. And ultimately, what we found, particularly at Level Access, is that in a hyper-competitive job market, people really do want to work at somewhere that ties into their core beliefs. And so if you kind of think about that, again, you get back to the highest level, it's like, well, it is the right thing to do, and you don't have to go too much beyond that. But if you come at it from a purely logical and capitalist perspective, you still end up with the same conclusions. And then the only other note I'd give you on that is our experience is that it is easy to say that changes with the size of an organization, that as you get bigger, we'll be big enough to worry about DE&I, but we're too small now. And I would just really push people on that thinking. I think it's at any scale you can have an impact, and you should be reasonable about how you can impact. But the idea that you're too small to have an impact from an organization size or even at a personal level, I think is a specious argument. I think you can really do a lot. And I would probably go so far as to say you should do a lot. But that's a wondrous debate we could have as we go.
Wonderful. Thank you. Chris, where do you see as a good step for organizations to start who are just getting into their journey and their prioritization of DEIA? Where do you start? What do you establish as an organization for a good step to take? And how do they create a plan to become more diverse and inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, I love what Tim just said about values, and I really think that it goes back to values. So whether you're an organization of 5 or an organization of 500, you have to know what your values are, and that should guide your process in creating a structure and a plan for your DEIA, agenda. And so I think you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are plenty of organizations out there right now, plenty of races, plenty of national governing bodies, plenty of nonprofits that are doing this the right way. And there is a template out there for folks who are just getting started on this journey. I think it's about identifying values and about figuring out what the process might be for different people coming into your organization. So, in all of our conversations today, I think we could take this from two different ways. It could be from internal, like your employee structure, your hiring practices, the makeup of your company, as well as your participants, right? Who is engaging with, who are your clients, who are your athletes. And so there are really those two different approaches, but I think it comes down to thinking about the different participants that may want to have access to your services and what the experience might be like for them going through. So if you're an already established company and you're thinking about, already established race, and you're thinking about, wow, I've never had a trans or non-binary athlete come through and go through our process. What might that be like in the registration portion of this, in the picking up my bib portion of this, in the different steps that athletes have to take to be involved in what you're doing. And so I think it's really about thinking through those structures that you have in place and wondering if there's any catch points for anyone that you have. And I think that's difficult if you lack certain types of diversity within your structure, right? So like a person who's not trans isn't going to know what my experience is like as a trans man trying to sign up for a race, trying to change my gender marker in my category when I was going through the early stages of my transition. People aren't going to know what that's like. And so it's important to bring different folks to the table to have these conversations, to identify maybe some opportunities for expansion within what you have already, and to make sure that everyone is being represented.
And how can you bring representation into the fold? Let's say, there's an organization who they're a small staff, they're from an undiverse, area of the country, they're not hiring. How do you bring diverse voices to the table without having to, fire all your employees and hire new diverse, how do you create that opportunity for those diverse voices to come into your organization, outside of changing your hiring structure or adding new employees or going those routes?
Well, I think this is where you leverage key partnerships, right? And strategic partnerships with organizations that are already doing this work. As an example, I have a website, transathlete.com. I have inclusive policies, I have model policies, I have steps for coaches, for athletic directors, for race organizers, and a lot of information there, and do consulting with folks. And so, I think that's just one example of there are organizations out there whose mission and life's work is to make sure that sport is more accessible for people in their community. And those would be the people that you should be engaging with, that you should be bringing to the table, and also that you should be compensating for their work.
Great. Let's move on to Angela. What do you see as some of the positive outcomes, both from a cultural sense, a community sense, and from a business sense, that come with organizations who commit to being more diverse and inclusive?
I think the business sense is simple. These are communities that have money to spend. So very small increase or shift, rather, I wouldn't even say it's an increase, but a shift in focus of where outreach goes is an ultimate ROI. We've seen research of, 4x ROI for culturally relevant outreach to segment audiences. So I think Tim said it best. It makes capitalist sense to do the right thing, and so that's the big opportunity there. Is you reach out to these communities. I wanted to build on something that Chris said, and I think it ties to this question. When you go out into these communities, people don't necessarily want to save the world, right? We always say they want to save the barrio, right? Save their communities, improve their communities, and so by giving back a little bit, I think organizations receive, multiple in return.
Wonderful. Next question. Let's start with Tim. What are some things someone who may not be in a leadership role at an organization, what can they do to bring these initiatives to their leadership to say, hey, this needs to be a priority, and help sell this prioritization of DEIA internally, when maybe the lead of the organization or the top of the organization isn't invested, but what can those kind of like non-leadership roles to get investment buy-in from the top down?
Yeah, so I'll build on the framing I think Chris started with to get you there. So let's say you start your journey in this space, and the first thing you do is you get some training and some research. Second thing you do is you engage with folks in the community, and you really start talking to people about it. And it's I want to drive change. How do I drive change? I hate to use the term cynical because I already used it once, but the cynical version of that, but it is actually quite a good technique, and I'll get you back to why it's ethically okay, is you find the person whose career benefits the most from this and who is willing to be a champion for it, and you help them tell the stories associated with that. And so to think about that in terms of organizational dynamics, people want to be able to look like the hero inside the organization. And there's a lot of pressure, particularly in larger organizations, at the CEO level, at the managing director level, whoever runs the organization, to be seen as a positive force in society. But candidly, most of the time, they're struggling with the mechanics of how to do that. So it's not that there's a lack of desire at the top, it's I don't really know what we should do. And so finding a person, like ideally in the C-level suite, but potentially that reports into the C-level suite, that says, look, I can give you this nice package that you can take back up to our leadership that says, here's something that's a relatively low cost effort we can do. It has demonstrable and significant experience, and it allows us to tell the story of our organization being on the side of the angels, being on the side of the right side of history. And ultimately, that's what I found. My point there is that it is not, in my experience, and we could have a wondrous debate about this, it's actually not about ROI. It's actually not about like the mechanics, and we can talk about all of that works. It's don't let that stuff get in the way of a good story that's beneficial to someone internally, because there really is a lot of pressure on leadership to be seen. And so what you want to do is package something up such that, you know, you can either take it to your boss or they can take it to their boss. And ultimately it gets into a board slide where they can talk about, hey, here's how we're having an impact as an organization.
Anything to add on that point, Chris?
Yeah, I love the idea of storytelling, and we know that storytelling is just so incredibly impactful for organizations, especially with external messaging. You know, as we see more campaigns that are happening that are including more diverse voices and diverse experiences within sport, we're starting to see that ripple out into who believes that sport is for them and whether or not they can actually engage with our organizations, with our events. And so I think that the storytelling piece is really impactful. And the piece that is the asterisk on that is that it can't just be about having a good marketing campaign that includes diverse voices, right? There has to be actual tangible things happening within the organization that are backing that up. As we like to say, show the receipts. You know, every June we see every organization, brand, and company put out a rainbow logo on their efforts, right? And have some sort of campaign that welcomes the LGBTQ plus community. And I think it's all fine and good. Like, we love the rainbow stuff. It's great. But on July 1st, you better believe that I'm looking for those receipts. You know, September 15th, December 2nd, I'm looking to see, all right, what have you done for the LGBTQ plus community? Where is your policy? What are your hiring practices? How are you supporting your employees? All of this. And so I think you have to back up the balance of the storytelling along with the actual practices. And then I just, love the idea of having a champion. Some people would call that an ally, but I think never underestimate what you can do as somebody who's not in a top position, because our consistency in showing up and advocating for communities, our consistency and persistence in calling out things when we see them and calling other people into the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion is what really makes the difference. I think that change happens from the top down. So we have somebody in leadership position say, this is our new policy. But it also happens from the bottom up. And this is when, it's actually preferred to have it be bottom up in an organization where your daily employees are calling people into this conversation, as opposed to having it be a group of angry runners who feel that they aren't being represented, that they aren't being treated fairly, that sport isn't for them. So I think we want this change to happen internally, and it happens when people are persistent and consistent about calling out things when they see them and advocating for those little pieces of change. just as an example, I threw my pronouns on the Zoom window and, just without saying anything, and other people put their pronouns up too. To me, as an LGBTQ person, that makes a huge difference. It signifies that this is a space where people are willing and interested in having conversations that would include me. And so, those things go a long way. So that ripple effect is really impactful.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And to your point, you had your pronouns on there. I did not. And when you showed that, you modeled that, I was like, I need to do that. I need to create that space for Chris, show that this is a safe space. And it's something I think a lot of us who don't live your experience it's not at the forefront of our mind, but it is for you every day. And so I think definitely mirroring or echoing what everyone has said here, it's also just taking a step out of our experiences, trying to understand what other people's experiences are and making sure that we're creating spaces that they feel comfortable in. And I think to that, not deviating away from this topic, what are things that races and events and endurance organizations do that show you as a trans athlete that they have created a safe and welcoming space for you, both before the event, on the day of the actual event, after the event? What is it that you look for to say, this is a safe and welcoming space for me and for other LGBTQ athletes?
Yeah, so, there are so many different components of this. One is social media, right? So I'm following my favorite brands and races on social media. And when they acknowledge important days in the community, when they acknowledge, as an example, so coming out day, I was featured in Runner's World in an article talking about how being trans how running helped me come out as a trans man. And, running was really important in my experience of understanding my identity, of telling other people my identity. So I follow all these brands. I'm looking for them to have throughout the year some sort of indication that they are supportive. Celebrating Pride Month is a fine one. They need to have the policies to back it up. I'm looking on the race registration. So is there an option beyond, male and female? And is there a place for me to identify my gender? Are they asking for pronouns? I've seen fewer races do that, and maybe it's not applicable they might not need that, but it's another way for me to self-identify, to let people know how I want to be referred to. Looking for incorporation of existing LGBTQ plus organizations, either in their partnership network, internally, like in the location of the race. So in Chicago, for example, partnering with the Center on Halsted, sending LGBTQ centers, or highlighting a group like the Front Runners, which is an LGBTQ plus running club. If that's a part of their media strategy of promoting and talking about people who are going to be there, in the storytelling efforts, in the photos of the finishers gear, including members of the LGBTQ plus community. There are so many places and spaces that I'm looking for just indications of people like me, people or the language that's used that tells me that I'm going to be welcome there. So I think those are the main ways that I'm looking as an athlete. And part of it is that registration process. I've actually not registered for races that I felt like either in their terminology or in their location of the race felt like it was going to be unsafe for me. So that's also a factor. Right now, with 10 states in our country banning transgender kids from playing sports with their friends in high school and younger grades, as well as in some cases in college, I'm looking for organizations that are speaking out on that. And I think it's a delicate balance, right? Because trans identity and LGBTQ plus topics have become politicized in a lot of ways, and politicians are using it as a tool to create a divide in the voter base. But I feel my identity is not political, right? I live this, I take this with me every day. And whether I'm in running shoes or riding a bike or swimming in a pool or at the grocery store, I'm trans all the time. And so I'm looking for the support of races that are going to say how they feel about these bans against trans people participating in sports. And in some cases, these bills and these laws might actually impact races that are not like college races or high school races, because some of them actually have wording that says that if it's a city property, so say you have your bib pickup at a city park or something like that, if you allow trans people to participate, you might actually be in violation of that law. So there are a lot of things that are dangerous for the trans community in sports right now, even if you're not a kid.
Thank you. I appreciate that insight. For Tim, what are some of the biggest pitfalls you see organizations making when it comes to approaching diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility?
Oh, Jackie, there are so many. Where should I start? No, I think honestly, the biggest pitfall starts off with they're afraid to offend anyone. And that in itself is not a bad motive. That's not what I mean by that, but they are paralyzed by the concern that they will do harm versus just being open, vulnerable, and honest about the fact that they don't know anything, or they don't know everything, rather. And so a lot of the paralysis comes when you're in conversations with folks, and it always comes out like this, like, what? Well, I don't know how to say this. I'm not sure if this is okay or if it's offensive, but like, and it's okay to ask the question and to start the process. So I think the first thing is just being comfortable having the discussion. And as long as you come, in my experience, but as long as you come from a place of genuine concern, genuine interest in trying to seek common ground, you will buy yourself some flexibility if you say something terrible. But you probably won't. Like you really probably won't mess it up too much. And I think people that have changed their pronouns in life are probably used to people messing up their pronouns. Doesn't mean it's okay. It doesn't forgive it. But, again, there's a degree of understanding that you can kind of start with. So I like that, but I also like start with people and don't think too much more than that. So one of the big challenges is I think people want to have a really discrete list of things that they can do and can act on. And it may not always be the same for every organization. So I like just find some people in the community that you want to target, have them come in and look at the full life cycle experience of what you have. In this case, registration for a race, prep for a race, day before, day of, et cetera. And have them just give you thoughts and feedback on it. And so those are kind of the two things. One is people are sort of afraid to start. They're paralyzed out of fear that they might offend people. And it's okay if you come from a good place and you're sensitive. But also don't overthink it in terms of just find some folks that you can talk to give you some comments and thoughts about where you want to go.
Great. I think that's great feedback, great advice. Next, for Angela, what opportunities do you see for endurance organizations to be more proactive and welcoming more diverse communities in organizations and events? How do we as an industry meet diverse communities where they are and show them that what we have is for them?
I think you get involved with those communities, either literally physically on the ground in the places where your events are held, or figuratively in the social space. I think there are tons, I know there are many Instagram profiles and groups of people who are actively working to get marginalized communities out in nature, running, hiking, boating, you name it, there's a group. And there are brands playing in that space. And those brands are your partners, are the same people who show up on the back of your t-shirts. So if I can name check a couple, I know that, Cliff is doing remarkable work trying to be more diverse and inclusive and being as a brand in spaces where communities of color are. I went on a hiking trip to Montana recently and I bought brand new Osprey bags for everybody. And you do like endless research. What's the best bag? And my bags were great and we loved them and we were hydrated. And I came back and after my trip, I saw that they had sponsored 10 Hispanic families hiking trips, first time ever to a national park. And I was like, damn, I'm so glad I picked them. If I had seen that in advance, I might've skipped all the research because company is out there doing the work of being present and helping, helping in a way. You take 10 families to the first national park, you have changed their lives forever. And you guys can do that. And your brand partners are doing that. So which are the brand partners who have taken a stand, right? Patagonia pulled out of Jackson Hole entirely, their biggest resort, because they didn't align with the values of the brand. You can't get Patagonia gear at the ski shops at the biggest resort in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Why? Because that resort didn't align with their values. So your peers are taking a stand already, are saying what they believe in. And those are the people who you want on the back of your shirts. Those are the brands you want to hand out at the finish line. These people are helping you in those ways. And if they aren't taking stands, or if they're taking stands that don't align with those values, then maybe those aren't the brands that you want to work with. I can tell you all the brands I work with are working with Alma because they believe in community outreach. And there are brands that, choose not to. And everyone lives their choices, I think, at the end of the day. But endurance races already are in a space of very easy inclusion of all kinds.
Yeah. And speaking of, consumers speaking with their wallet, we know that our industry skews older, it skews pretty white. How are we, without prioritizing this, what do you see our outcomes with the younger generations, younger millennials, Gen Z? What does their patronage look like when they speak with their dollars and we're not following, or we're not prioritizing DEIA?
They're not spending, or they're shifting their spend. And they're creating their own spaces. I think we need to follow what they're doing. What are the spaces that they're creating for themselves? Where they, whether they can boycott at scale to really impact a brand, they can certainly create enough noise on TikTok to get some attention and to sway their peers. So, I think that generation is making it abundantly clear. I can tell you, and they're doing it at younger and younger ages. I think that's the crucial thing that has shifted. So if your board and your decision makers are all older white gentlemen, it might be time to pull in some young folks. Even young white people have a different point of view. I think the youth is really driving the change and pushing brands, organizations, the government, everybody to take a different stand. If you have any young people in your life, ask them, show them to scroll TikTok with you. Who are the runners that they're following? My 11-year-old is like, hey, Mom, you've got to be inclusive. Look. I'm like, oh, cool. That's amazing.
Great. Back to Chris. How can races and race organizations, I know you have a ton of experience on this front, how can endurance event organizations adapt or how can they affect change when governing bodies may not be moving forward with them? What can they do what are actionable steps that they can do to help push these organizations forward and help push the governing bodies forward so that the industry as a whole can be more inclusive?
Yeah, a lot of it is, thinking about the needs of the people that you're serving and knowing that in many cases, it comes down to the level of play, right? So national governing bodies have rules, and sometimes they're called guidelines. They're not really rules. They're rules for national governing body competitions, maybe like a Team USA competition, but not necessarily trickling down to your local 10K. And so every race organization has the opportunity to, unless it is a qualifier for a championship event, to create policies that are more inclusive than what is already out there. This is the same thing for national governing bodies versus the International Olympic Committee policy for trans athletes or for anyone, that you always have the opportunity to be more inclusive. And then when you get to that level of play, have to fall in line with those policies. But I think as a person who's watched policy change and evolve and has tracked policies over the last 8 years, I've been really thrilled to see that of all of the sports that I look at, all the policies that I look at, running and multi-sport has actually been leading the way. And so like around the idea of trans and non-binary inclusion, for example, we have more and more runners who are trans and non-binary who have been in the media, and usually not under great circumstances. It's usually because they're being targeted or harassed because they're trans, But for most of the athletes that we're seeing in the media, it's been trans women who are runners. And so I think that's an interesting, thing, that of all of the sports that there are, that running has been the sport where we're seeing people want to participate and feeling comfortable being themselves. And then along with that, we see that the targeting of athletes has been against those people as well. And so that, if you're visible, then there will be pushback. So I think in terms of making sure that we're reaching out, including folks, making sure that we are thinking about who is at risk. We're all intersectional beings as well. And so we can't just, boil this down, this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion to just my trans identity, right? The trans people that we're seeing mostly targeted are trans women, and they're largely trans women of color. And trans people from the global south and women from the global south who are having their bodies scrutinized and policed at disproportionate rates versus other competitors. We have to think about all of those intersections of identities. There are LGBTQ people with disabilities who still want to participate, right? There are so many different parts of who we are and what we come to the sport with. I've seen running respond to the criticism, to the visibility of trans athletes by creating policies. So trail running, as an example, ultra racing have been incredible in creating policies that recognize trans identity and non-binary athletes, and also are creating spaces where they can be on podiums, where they have an actual category where they can feel comfortable showing up. And I think it's important to note that not every trans person wants to be in a third category. That is not the solution for our participation. But there are some non-binary participants who don't feel comfortable choosing one of the two options that are presented to them. So having a non-binary category for people to self-select into is a really great option. And there are major races that are doing it really well right now. So I would look to organizations that have these policies already in place, take cues, take notes, but also cross-check and make sure that it's the right thing for your race, for your space, and given the current policies and procedures that you already have in place, because it might be disingenuous to jump in to copy and paste someone else's policy without doing your own internal work on that process first.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to jump over to Tim. As an employer of persons with disabilities, what steps do you take to create welcoming spaces for your employees that events can for your employees who have disabilities that events can learn from and implement, both on the employee side and on the participant side of things?
On the employee side, we tend to focus on, first and foremost, training. And I'm a fan of just basic awareness training. And it sounds weird to say this, but there are people with disabilities. They interact with the world in different ways, but they're just people like anybody else. And this is a loaded word, so bear with me, but it sort of destigmatizes things. And I'm not a fan of that framing, but it does create a little space to have a conversation about people are different and they have different abilities. And so tactically, what that means is we look at technology that can be useful for people with disabilities. So people come in with visual disabilities, we'll give them screen readers, we'll give them various different technologies. And there's a bunch of stuff that occupational therapists can help you work through on that on the employment side. But on the employment side, we tend to focus on training, and then we tend to focus on policies. And ultimately, it's about ensuring that we're creating space internally to have constructive discussions about what individuals need, and both that people know that it's okay to ask for support, but that it's also okay to ask people if they need support or help in different ways. And again, doing that respectfully. On the other side, for organizations that we work with in their public facing activities, so we're very much in the digital medium. And so we look at websites and mobile applications all day long. And basically what we're looking at is, are they coded properly? And so ultimately, if they're coded properly, they will then work in various different types of technology that are used by people with disabilities. We had a poignant example of that earlier today where we were talking about captioning, and do you have captioning available? And you can do that sort of post-processing, et cetera. That's a good example of a consideration you would think through as you look at an accessibility checklist. And so we look at things like that. Basically, did you code the technology properly? I'm also going to put in a slug, Jackie. I want to ask a question too at some point. So come back to me. I have a question.
Sure. Sure. Sorry, I muted myself. I think a really important piece of this is how, okay, let's say we've all committed to this, to DEIA being a part of our culture, being a part of our DNA as an organization. We're doing the work, we're creating the policies, we're bringing in representation to hear diverse voices and making sure that they have their voices represented at our organizations. I don't think it's enough to just say we're doing this. How do we then go out to the, like we said, how do we proactively communicate to these communities, we are for you? And when it comes to marketing, how do we do that in a way that is authentic? How do we do it in a way that's truly engaging? How do we do it in a way that doesn't feel like we're tokenizing these communities for the business benefit of our organization? I don't know, Angela, if you want to start that one.
I think just do it. Put some messaging out there. A little bit of what everybody has said so far. If you go out and you speak to folks, if you choose the right influencers to hype your race, your event, you'll bring these people in. If you speak their language, right? Whether it's, speaking Spanish because you're reaching a Hispanic audience, or you're speaking, authentically in the LGBTQ space, you've got the right person saying the right things, right? It's not like, hey, we put our rainbow up, come join us, or, there'll be rice and beans at the end of the race. So those aren't the things. So it's having the right people speak the right language and just pulling them in. Small bits of marketing. Obviously, you don't need the budget of the brands that I work on most days, but I have a lot of tiny brands who spend a little bit of money and a lot of effort and goodwill and reach their communities and have big impact. I think when you're going from nothing to something, the ROI is huge. If you haven't reached out to a community, whether it be in the disability space and in a particular ethnic heritage, a particular sexual orientation, like if you haven't reached these people, they will respond because all of them are hungry and eager for brands and organizations to just be welcoming, right? Not even do anything special, just show that they're welcome here. We haven't addressed, I think Chris covered, pronouns and registration forms, but is the registration form available in Spanish? You have a global audience. Is it in another language where maybe you might get a lot of racers looking to do it? German, French. There's a lot of very easy things that it's just, a toggle button, and you don't have to do anything else other than translate your website. So yeah, start small and do one thing, I would say.
And we were speaking of storytelling earlier. I think it's important to also, share that consumers don't necessarily, it's not necessarily about the story you have to tell consumers. It's how their stories fit in with your brand. And so how can you engage with your consumers to tell their stories to reach consumers who are like them?
Can't say that any better, Jackie.
All right. Okay. For Tim and Angela, maybe if you guys want to jump on this one, statistics show that persons with disabilities represent 20% of the population, but only make up about 2.5% of representation in marketing and media. What can we do to change that? And how can endurance events highlight the stories of athletes with disabilities?
Angela, you want to go first? You want me to take a stab at it? You go first.
Who is building these stories? Who are the people at the table? If you're doing, online videos, if you're creating online videos or print ads or banners, who is picking the talent? Who is telling those stories? Do you have guide runners and can you feature them on the front of your webpage? Do you have, what other things are you doing already that make it an inclusive space that you can feature in your marketing, right? In the banner ads and the social posts. I think that's the easy place to start. What are you doing and making sure people know? And then if you're hiring talent or, asking runners to be in your marketing, make sure you've got more than just people who look like the people at the table making decisions. That's where I'd start.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that often we focus on what we aren't doing and we're not focusing on what we are already doing, and just making sure people know that, hey, we're doing these things, so that maybe they're just not aware. Of course, I'm sure there's always more we can all be doing to be more diverse and inclusive, but what are the things that you're already doing that would make diverse communities feel welcome, and just making sure that those stories are told. It's not even necessarily doing new things, it's telling the stories of the things you're already doing. So I think that's great. Tim, you want to add to this question as well?
So I like putting targets around these things. And what I mean by that is I think it's okay to say in the people stories that you're profiling, to go to the extent of saying, hey, look, we want to have a diverse slate of races, genders, people with disabilities. I think that's okay, because if you're only ever doing it based on a statistical population and the vast majority of your population is middle-aged white dudes, you're only ever going to have middle-aged white dudes. Like you're never going to move the needle. People can sometimes feel like that's a little icky. And I could see why people think that, but I think it's okay to just say, look, we are really going to be very deliberate about featuring different stories. And that's not disingenuous. That is, in fact, empowering to people that are coming from different communities. So that'd be my thought, is don't worry about that so much. And then the other is like, keep it simple, keep it emotionally impactful, and don't try to make really complicated arguments. And so it's like having an 18-page long scrolling piece of text that features somebody's back life story. That might be great. That might be the right media, but it's probably not as impactful as a well-produced 90-second video. Angela will probably give you a much more intelligent perspective on that, that's supported by data, but just give it to people in easy and emotionally compelling fashions, and don't worry about making a case so much to drive societal change. Just show a diversity, and ultimately that'll drive more things more effectively, in my experience. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it gives you some flavors on it. Hey, can I ask my question? Because it actually dovetails into this. So this is the question I had, honestly. So it was pretty close. I've sometimes found organizations will do a lot of the good work here, but then they fail to get credit for it. They'll do some work, they'll engage the community, they'll actually put together good policies, and they really will run inclusive events, and they'll have inclusive employee approaches, but then they won't actually tell the story. And it's because they're afraid to get it wrong or offend someone, or that they can't get the attention of the marketing team. How do you think about that and helping coaching organizations through that?
Is a question for me specifically? Or
it's for the entire panel.
Chris, do you want to tackle that one?
Well, I can say a little bit, I guess. I am curious about your perspective, Jackie, because you're sitting in a different seat. But I've been involved in campaigns or campaigns where the first version of the script came back and it was cringy. It was really offensive, actually. And the reason that it was is because there weren't trans people at the table trying to write those stories or consulting with me about what my story actually is to make sure that they get it right. And when organizations actually do get it right and they want people to know, I think they have to be really intentional about outreach, about there are pockets where these communities already live and exist. And if you think that your policy or your great event would be helpful to them or would be welcoming to them, reach out to those organizations, try to create those strategic partnerships that I mentioned, because word of mouth is one of the best ways to get anybody involved and engaged. Especially right now as an athlete, we are chomping at the bit to get these races under our belts right now, because it's been so long. we went through a big dry spell during COVID, and just the athletes that I'm around, that I coach myself, like we cannot wait to get out there and toe the line. And so if you are doing, and that also means as things are coming back more online, and not like virtually online, but like races are coming back up again, that we have a lot of options too. Like look at this fall, we had so many marathon majors, we had so many local races that were able to put things together. There were a lot of options to the point where many athletes are over raced now at this point. I think that you have to be intentional about telling these stories because people have a lot of options. And Gen Z, as we mentioned, the younger generation, we are voting with our dollars. And so if it's a matter of being able to do race 1 or race 2, and race 2 cares about climate justice and has made outreaches and is intentional in their messaging about recycling and things like that, I'm going over there because that's important to me, because climate justice is racial justice, is disability justice, is trans justice, So we have to be telling these stories. You have to be intentional about your outreach. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you are in control of the messaging that you put out there. Someone else can either tell your story, or you can take control and make sure that it's getting to the people who need to hear it and making sure that it's getting pushed out. And with social media, we all are our own advertising agencies. Like we can all make this happen.
Yeah, I think one other thing that organizations can do is pick out those headlines. If you've set a benchmark, like Tim suggested, and you met that benchmark, if you're the first race in Dade County to be carbon neutral, toot that horn, right? Even if it's a small headline, it can make a difference, and it starts positioning you. First race to have more than 2 gender categories. Put that out there. It doesn't need to be hugely expensive, but certainly it can be part of your messaging that you've accomplished something.
And I definitely want to add on to that and say that I think as an industry, we tend to look at runners. We tend to say, how do we reach runners? Instead of saying, how do we reach consumers who may not be runners, who may not be part of the running community because they don't feel it's for them? And how do we expand our reach? So we're not just marketing to active runners. We're not just marketing to people who have patronized our race or other races. It's how do we reach out to people who are doing group fitness? How do we reach out to swimmers? Or someone who's never done any activity and maybe is now interested in running, and we're showing that this community can be for them as well. So I think that's the other thing too, is we tend to toot our own horn, but we do it within our industry, and we don't do it outside into the larger community to show them what we're building and what we're creating here. So I think that's part of it too, is shifting our mindset to expand the reach of who we're targeting.
Excellent.
We were talking about ROI earlier. This may be a useful perspective, but it's a technology industry, and so technology companies think about net new. So how do you get new people in? And then I think about retention. How do you keep people? And that was the thing I jot down here in the background. It's like an easy way to think about your ROI here, after I told you don't think about ROI and do it because it's just inherently good, was like, are you getting new racers that you didn't see before? And then are you retaining the ones that you have? And those are actually like very profound financial metrics if you follow that all the way through to valuation impacts, actually.
And they're both very important, both net new and retention. It typically costs less to keep somebody than it does to get somebody new. But if you're not getting new people, then you're not growing. So they're both very important metrics and both very important parts of your marketing strategy.
We are getting to the top of the hour. I can't believe we could probably talk for at least another hour here on this. It's such an engaging group, but we did have a couple of folks submit questions that I was hoping we could just sort of touch on before we wrap up. And they're sort of tied together. So I'm going to give both questions. And I think it's probably, between Jackie and Chris, I think you guys can probably answer to these. What advice do you have on making our overall and age group awards more inclusive? Do we break down the categories beyond male and female? And if so, how do we handle only 1 or 2 participants in a certain gender in smaller races? And then the second part of this question from someone else is, in the ever evolving word, is non-binary the appropriate term for a third competitive division, or would a more inclusive phrasing such as non-binary gender expansive be more inclusive and forward-looking?
Yeah, I'll start with the last one first. I think, non-binary and gender expansive is a great way to phrase it. Also, non-binary would probably satisfy that need depending on your tech ability. And, I know there are certain things behind the scenes in programming that makes that challenging. So non-binary, gender expansive, not every gender expansive person identifies as non-binary. So you are really opening it up. And that becomes pretty clear that you are talking about people who identify outside of male and female for those race categories. In terms of how to, if you only have 2 people in the non-binary category, then awesome for that person who got first because they beat all the other people. Like, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter how many people are in the category. It's the same thing if I went to a local race and was in the men's competition, but there's only 2 guys. Like, that's what it is, right? So I guess it would be a women's race probably if I was showing up. There's usually more than 2 guys in all my races. But that said, I think that you don't have to worry about the number of participants. It's more about you have to offer that category. And if you offer it, like if you build it, they will come. So you might have 2 participants your first time, and then you might have 1, and then you might have 3, and then you might have that grow over the course of several seasons. And so I would just offer it. And if people take advantage of it, awesome. I don't mean take advantage of it. I mean, use it. And the other part of that category is that the challenge that most people have is this fear that people will take advantage of that category. And I just want to say, like, no trans person or non-binary person is transitioning to gain athletic glory or to gain a competitive advantage. And fortunately, the way that toxic masculinity and the patriarchy work, no cisgender man is pretending to be trans or non-binary to try to win in the non-binary category in sport. It's just not happening. So offer those categories, offer that option for people to run. If you're looking for examples of this, New York Roadrunners has a recently introduced non-binary participation. I think policy and category, I've seen runners posting about it. And this is in New York City, and I'm pretty sure it's just a handful of people who are using this category right now. But the messaging is there, they're talking about it, it exists. And as more and more, as you have those 8 people who participated this race, they're going to go tell their non-binary friends, they're going to talk about it in their community forums and their spaces. And we're going to see that grow over time, particularly as more and more young people are identifying as something outside of just the gender binary of male and female.
I can share that we as a technology platform recently launched some improvements to our platform on this exact topic. And in just a very short period of time, have had almost 100 participants choose something other than male or female. And that's 100 participants that were either not participating before because they didn't feel welcome, or were choosing something they didn't identify with. And that is just, more than unfortunate that they had to choose something that they didn't identify as. And, I'm really proud that we're able to offer this now, and that they were able to choose something that more closely aligns with what they identify as. And it's just creating that space, right? More than anything, it's just allowing people to be in the space how they want to be in it. So whether it's 8 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000, that is giving people the experience that they want to have, and creating a space for, exactly for them. And so I think that's the important part, is it doesn't matter if you have 1 person in that category or you have 1,000 people.
Awesome. We are at time. I can't believe how quickly that went. Jackie, thank you so much for spearheading this conversation. To Chris, Tim, and Angela, thank you for your transparency and your candidness in the conversation. It's a conversation we as an industry need to continue to have, not just, today, but say, hey, we did that. We want to keep having this conversation and be part of, evolving and making our space and our industry much more inclusive to everyone. With that, we're going to go ahead and sign off, and just on behalf of Running USA, thank you to everyone that attended, and know that again, this will be posted this afternoon so that you can share it with your teams and go back and, view it again. And, that's it. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your week. Good job.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.